Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Here with we're going to talk about some data today, and so a little about my history, who you're speaking with. I want to give just a quick introduction there, but before I do, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a couple questions as we go through. If you can you can pop it up in a browser and type slido.com, type that number in, or you can just pull out your phone, scan that QR code. I'm just going to ask a couple questions just to kind of see where people are at and what they're thinking to make sure we're leaning into the right direction there. If you can pop into that Slido, there'll be some questions pop up here shortly as we jump in. And if you don't happen to get that, maybe Megan, if you could drop that code into the chat there so that if they miss this QR, they can still get it. So a little about myself, really quick. I spent 23 years in the K-12 sector in facilities. Both, I began my career as a technician, did HVAC and electrical work. Worked in that for a period of time in a rural district with about 6,000 students. Worked up through into an assistant director there, and then moved over to a large urban district with about 55,000 students, where I ended up there as the executive director of facilities, used FMX as my CMMS platform while I was there for 5 years, and then recently moved over here to FMX as a solutions engineer and evangelist. So trying to make sure that we get the right products in front of the right people and making sure they're configured to get the most value out of it. I'll say from here, I always remain in my customer hat. I still twitch a little bit when somebody says it's cold. I'm still a recovering facilities director. So just because I'm over here working at FMX doesn't mean I still don't feel the pains of the 23 years working in the K-12 sector. So I want to lead with kind of a resounding thought here that I want us to consider throughout the entire portion of this presentation. It seems in facilities, I recall being that technician. We were working in the mechanical rooms, up in the mezzanine, on the roof, maybe doing various things. And a lot of people just really don't see what all you're doing from day to day until something goes wrong. And that's when they see, that's when you're the technician going back to that same classroom over and over and saying, I'm really sorry, we're here again. We're going to get this fixed for you this time, I promise. And then next week you're doing the same thing. That's when people see you. But what we want to do is make sure that they see you when things are going right too, because that's justification for correcting things within your programs, getting more efficient, getting the resources that you need, protecting your people, protecting your budgets, things we're going to talk about. So the resounding comment here is you're doing more than people realize. Make sure they can see it. And that's the thought I want you to maintain in your head as we go through this presentation. And one of the things that, kind of a lesson that I learned over time was if you don't tell your story with data, someone else will tell it for you, and it will not be the story you want. For years, I fought that, working with boards and executive cabinet, and trying to get things that I needed, but coming to them with the wrong approach and allowing an opportunity for them to formulate their own story because I didn't fill in the blanks. And so that's the blanks we're going to try to fill in today, or at least give you some ideas of where to lean. I'm just talking about some lessons I've learned here and maybe a few best practices. How that fits into your program, you'll have to figure that part out for sure. But always here to bounce those ideas off of if you'd like. And so here comes that first question that I want you to respond to if you can on that Slido poll. And again, you could scan that QR code there. That question should pop up for you. And I'm basically just looking for, if we're thinking about data and we're thinking about, various KPIs and metrics, things of that nature, what metrics should you be tracking? There's a ton of different things that we're doing every day, and that creates information for us. So maybe what metrics do you think you should be tracking? I'll give just a moment for a few of you maybe to pop in some ideas there, and then I want to dive into some of those things. On a side note, while you're answering that question there, I'm an avid beekeeper on the side. So I run about 150 colonies of honeybees, and I think last year I made 7 or 8,000 pounds of honey. So just fun fact, something I do on the side there. It's kind of that's my happy place when I go work in my bees. So when I get up from the computer every day after working with these with our software system and things and talking to customers, I go play with my bees. Yes. So starting to get some answers popping in here now. Hours to complete work orders, number of work orders for the same equipment. Absolutely. I love talking about capital planning. I'm going to touch on that a little bit today too. So how are we engaging with that equipment? Maintenance costs versus replacement costs. Yes, same area with that capital planning. Open versus closed tickets. I like that one. It's probably one of the most simple of metrics, but often overlooked. And I'm actually going to dive into that one a little bit. Um, Response time, preventative maintenance, PM metrics. Yep. Trying to look through some of these. They rolled off of my screen. Man, y'all are throwing some good stuff in there. I like it. Oh, this Slido thing like threw in some cool stuff here where it actually started categorizing. I've never seen it do that. So work order, response, and time. So those are absolutely right. And equipment. Yep, perfect. You all are already on it. I think Megan, we can probably just go ahead and shut this thing down and we'll just move on. I think they've already presented for me here. So well, anyway, we'll move forward here. I love some of those responses. I want to talk first about work order volume. And a few of you threw that in the chat there. I do appreciate that one. That is, again, it's one of the most simple things, but sometimes we're not pulling that information out and actually letting people see that and showing that at work. And so 8 or 9 years ago, when I was managing a maintenance program, the I started pulling data out of our CMMS system at that time. And at that time, I wasn't using FMX. I had to pull that out into a spreadsheet, do some pivot tables and things. And one of the charts that I came up with was this chart here. And I used to work with my supervisor team to be like, what does this data mean to us? And so, for example, we're in K-12 market, and you think about just focus on the red line, received work orders. That red line, as we're transitioning into air conditioning mode, we're starting to see a spike, and getting toward the end of the year, everybody's putting in work orders, and then we dip as we go into the summer, and then we jump back up there as everybody's returning from school. We have a little lag, and then we switch over to heat. That was for us in North Carolina here. We switch over to heat and have a little bit of a bubble in work orders, and then we got a little bit slow as we went into the holidays and rinse and repeat. And I could overlay this chart year over year over year, and that red line would be exactly the same. But what I found was the interesting fact was if we start looking at the blue line, the completed work orders, the blue line trended right along with our received work orders. And that was perplexing to me at first. I understood that during the summer, we were going to as a volume, we were going to complete less work orders because we were working on work orders that took a longer amount of time. That's an important thing that we can pull out of this for communication to our bosses and our boards and things of that nature. Like, yeah, we're going to complete less work orders in the summer. But what was always perplexing to me is why is it that we follow the trend of our received work orders? And my first gut reaction was, y'all are slowing down. That's what came out first. And what it did for me was that it intrigued me to dive in a little more. And so just for reference, now we can run that report out of FMX. You see that similar report there showing that trend over time. And what's interesting is this is a 2-year report. And we noticed the spike. It's at the exact same time in the year. The dips are at the same time in the year. So that trend continues year over year. But why does the completed work orders trend with the received work orders? And if you got any thoughts to that, like go ahead and drop them in the chat because I'm interested to know. Like I always worked on this particular trend over time. But what it led me to do was it led me to dive into maybe, yeah, I've already talked about some of this, but end of school, season changes, summer, holidays, all that good stuff. But I started digging into our labor trends. So not only talking about work order intake and stuff, these are data sets that I would show to our board in like a, an annual or a biannual report to say, hey, this is what we're dealing with year over year. But I wanted to understand that trend. And so I started digging into our labor stuff just a little bit. So that takes us another step. So time to dig into the labor. Here's what I saw when I started. This is just an example. This is a really common one I saw. I started looking at our actual work tickets. And just as an example, maybe we got a work ticket in that said toilet's running constantly. And then when I looked at the response notes, they were very simple. It might be two words, just like this, bad diaphragm. And, I've never been a plumber, but I have replaced the diaphragms in toilets before. And I got to thinking about that. And I said, from the time a technician gets out of the truck, walks into a building, checks in with the front office, cuts off the water valve on the toilet, pops the cap off, drops the diaphragm in there, puts the cap back on, turns the valve back on, and gets that toilet back operating. That's not 2 hours. And and so I started really trying to understand what's going on. And so I started talking to some of my technicians. Well, I would pull out specific work orders and they would say, well, this happened, and something else went on. And then I had to go take care of this work order down the hallway that there wasn't a ticket on. I said, oh, now we're answering a question. Now we're starting to find exactly what's going on here. And so sometimes I found that 2 hours wasn't accurate. And then sometimes that 2 hours was accurate, but the response notes weren't accurate. And so back to that beginning statement, we we need to make sure that we're, telling our story here. How are we telling our story? So that was the communication I started having with the technicians. So data doesn't always have to be something that we're pushing upward. It can be a communication internally to say, how can we better validate what we're currently working on, justify our work. If there's something else happen while we're there, let's create another work order. Instead, what we were doing was just going to the end of the day. And so here's another trend that I started running was, when did they physically put the time in during the day? And what we saw here was a spike at the end of the day, around 3 or 4 o'clock. Had a little, some came in the morning. And what they were doing was they were putting in, the majority of the technicians were putting in the data for their work orders at the end of the day. So what what opportunity does that leave for us? The opportunity I see is, for one, we forgot what all we did that day. Do we miss actually completing work orders that we did during the day? Um, and secondly, do we remember exactly what we did on those work orders? Can we really put the appropriate response notes in? How about if we start talking about asset management a little bit? Did we tag the equipment to the work order so that we're building data for that piece of equipment? Probably not if we're doing it at the end of the day. And then fourth, more of the negative approach here. Are we just coming in at the end of the day and making sure that we show 7 hours every single day, of wrench turning time? And so what I wanted to do was be able to see this start rising as we get to 8 or 9 o'clock and maintain some kind of steady approach throughout the entire day, because I wanted real live data. I did not want responses like this. It's a bad diaphragm. And with 2 hours on that. And I also didn't want to see consistency in that 36 to 40 hours. Because what happens is, when I started looking at the labor hours was, if I'm a painter and I'm going to a facility and I'm there all day, I'm doing a scheduled painting of a facility. I don't have drive time throughout the day. I don't have any of those things. I'm leaving the shop in the morning. I'm going out to work on this project, and at the end of the day, I'm coming back. And so I should be accruing closer to 8 hours a day of wrench turning time. On the opposite of that front, maybe we're covering, 50 schools across our district, and we have one or two people that work on boilers. Well, they're driving from space to space. And for those, if I'm just tracking wrench turning time, maybe I'm not seeing 7 hours. I might be seeing 5 or 6 hours because we're routing them all over the district, which brings up the point of, are we routing appropriately? Do we have good processes? Are we staffed appropriately when we think about our various departments? And so the point is, we can't see any of that information unless we report that information out. So sometimes those conversations remain internal. It's how can we improve our processes? But sometimes those can expand out beyond there to another thought process here. How can we justify expanding our programs if we don't even have our work order data over time? So if we're thinking about our orange line here, work orders increasing over time. Look at this maintenance technician allotment. This is real data from when I was in facilities. Um, that to me that's a problem. But if I'm not cleaning up the efficiency and showing my work and telling my story, how can I justify increasing it? Well, we finally figured out how to tell that story right here, and we got some additional technicians right there, as you see. But it just goes back to, we got to be able to pull the data out, and then where can that data lead us? So we started at the very beginning there. One of the first things I looked at was work orders in, work orders out. Where did that lead me? That led me to digging into labor a little bit more. Once we dig into labor, that leads you into another path. So the point of that is, how can we use a data for our benefit and be able to drive through and improve our processes and justify additional resources? So the whole goal here is, as well as those internal conversations, how are we telling our story outwardly? And so I want to be able to change the narrative. When someone tells you you're not responding enough without data, our typical response, and I gave this exact same response many times. I said, maintenance is behind, or we don't have enough people, or something like that. It's just there's no data to back that up. But with data, how does that conversation change? It changes to, maintenance is handling 1,200 tickets with 3 techs and still hitting a 92% completion rate. That is a data-driven conversation. That is something that's tough to argue with. I want to pop one more question up here because this is the direction I want to go from here, is talking about changing that narrative. So next question is, what is your biggest challenge with presenting to the board? And you could use this conversation to be to the board or to your executive cabinet, depending on where you fall in the org chart, things like that. Just what's your biggest challenge with, maybe you have a big ask of the board. Maybe you're trying to do a capital project. Maybe you're trying to expand the number of maintenance employees that you have. Maybe you're trying to justify an operational budget. What's your biggest challenge there when presenting? I'll pause there just a second and wait on a few responses to pop in. I appreciate you all participating in the polls here, because it's really helpful for me, and I know you're paying attention. That's what I love. Forward thinking investments. Yep. That that's interesting. Two of those responses there, of making it plain and digestible, and providing enough data to satisfy, but not so much they know every detail. That is that is quite the conundrum, because we can quickly, get outside the realm of knowledge of, groups of people. The people in this room they probably know mechanical equipment and, know things like that. But when we start really diving in to that, we have to make it understandable for sure, or we can just lose someone, and then they're going to make up another story because they didn't understand what we were saying. Translating maintenance data into business impact. Yeah, that's that's 100%. So if we're not presenting the data, we're giving the board the opportunity to make an operational decision instead of a fiscal decision. And so how many times have you gone into, one of these meetings, maybe, and I'm guilty of this, a little bit unprepared, not bringing the data to back up your question or back up your ask. And then the boards, in my experience, the board would jump in and start trying to make operational decisions. And if you've had any experience like I have, like that's an absolute nightmare. You're on live TV on the dais presenting to the board. I'll tell you a little story about I was we had this chiller at one of our schools that was giving us a lot of trouble. And this was a newer facility. It was in an affluent section of our district. And in socioeconomic terms, our district was very diverse, and so we had schools that had a higher rate of poverty in those, and then we had other schools that just were over the top affluent. And this chiller was at an affluent school. This chiller was giving us trouble. This chiller was not 25 years old. It was less than 20 years old. And so we're dealing with this situation. Chiller's going down. We're running it at half capacity, got a bad circuit on it, and just continuing to work on it. No telling how much money we had spent on this chiller so far. And so the capital projects team went to the board and they just said, hey, we need to replace this chiller. And it absolutely exploded. The board meeting exploded about why would we replace that chiller? Why are we putting a chiller out there? That makes no sense. That school's new. You got all these other schools with old equipment. You're not putting enough money there, and it was a complete disaster. And so how did we change that narrative? We unfortunately it didn't get replaced in a timely manner, and it ended up going a period of time before we could actually put the data together that should have been put together to begin with. That's what we try to do with the comprehensive maintenance management system with our assets in there, because this data should be at your fingertips. And so what we ended up doing was we pulled together, how many dollars we had spent on that, but pulling that together without the right CMMS was an absolute nightmare. It was basically the HVAC supervisor's opinion. They had to pull that out and say, well, I got this invoice and I have this invoice and I have this invoice. We ended up coming back around using that data and representing it and realizing that we had spent about 15% of the replacement asset value in repairs in less than 18 months. And so, that $500,000 chiller, we had spent, whatever 18% of that is, but $9,000. I mean, yeah, whatever, $90,000 on it, which was quite a lot. And so it didn't make sense. But when we brought that back to the board with that data, now they weren't trying to make an operational decision on where we should place those funds. It was, here's the funds, do what's best with them. And so my view is always, how do we make sure that the boards remain in the policy making decisions and the fiscal decisions instead of the operational decisions? But so oftentimes we blame the boards for our operational hiccups because we're not bringing the right stuff forward. And if we're bringing that forward, we're going to be getting the things that we need, and we're going to be getting those timely. So last question here. So how would you respond to the question, why does the building continue to have HVAC complaints? I guarantee everybody in this room has had some kind of comment like that said, why do we keep having issues on the 400 wing of this high school, or what's going on over here? And out of your current setup, how do you respond to that? Do you have the data, or do you tell them because it's a piece of junk? Any takers? Any takers? Nobody wants to talk to me on this one, Megan. Oh, there we go. We got a couple. There we go. Okay. So the recurring complaints are largely tied to aging infrastructure and system limitations. We're using work order and maintenance data to identify repeat problem areas, prioritize corrective actions, and plan long-term improvements rather than only reacting to individual complaints. I actually like that response. That's good. The the thing I would say is if who are we responding to? Are we responding to a staff member, or are we responding to a cabinet member, or responding to a board member? I wonder if that changes a little bit. I remember on the last poll we did, we were talking about how do we change a technical description to something that can be understood? So that that statement right there probably changes a little bit. Well, you respond the same to all to be consistent. I wonder if you enter more data into the conversation if we are, talking to, our chief operations officer or something, as opposed to maybe a parent complaint. Just food for thought. The basis of the statement is 100%. What I like to do is we got one more participant typing. I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait just another second. Have you submitted a work order? I love it. I love it. That is so perfect right there. Uh, I, it was. I don't know how many times I got an email from a board member that said, "Hey, we're getting complaints about blah 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 area," and I go into the work order system and I go searching through, and there's not a single work order on it. They said we've been having issues with this for 6 months. It just continues to be a problem. And but that is the most easy response I can give back to that board member. Then is I can say I've created a work order for this, and we will investigate. But just note, no one has submitted a work order for this to date. And I always loved sending those back because that was just perfect. Um, the other comment there, the system is outdated and preventative maintenance efforts aren't addressing the core issue. Yeah, so that's exactly where we start migrating the conversation into capital as well. But here's some examples. Why do we continue to have HVAC complaints on the 400 wing of the school without data? Because that chiller is a pile of junk. I've said that before. Um, with data though, the chiller's 27 years old. We've put 18K of work into it in the past 18 months compared to other chillers in the district. This one's costing us 10% more in operational costs. I love to be able to put, if we have 10 chillers across our district and then we look at stuff like this is things that you can pull out of a CMMS system or should be able to, you know, hey, I want to compare all of my chillers across all of my schools. And then I want to look at something like this maintenance cost over replacement asset value. Do we see an anomaly here? All of these, that I don't even have the date ranges on here for you, but just as a metric here, maintenance cost over replacement asset value as a percentage, 1.54, that one's doing phenomenally well. It's probably a little newer, 2.53, 5.76, but boom, that one right there is at 15%. That's my anomaly. That's clear and apparent data to make a decision around. So if that one's maybe 5 more years out from replacement, and this one right here is up for replacement next year, do we change what we're going to do now with data? And can we present that data to someone who's making that fiscal decision and saying we are choosing to move this one forward and defer this one because of this operational cost that we're seeing? Not to mention other operational costs that we could see, maybe in energy consumption, because maybe the chiller's running at a partial capacity and we're having to run it longer hours to keep up, things like that. Our labor time that's out there and trying to keep that piece of equipment running. Tons of different impacts that we can see, but being able to see that data, that's an easy presentation. I hope you all agree with that. I I never got argued with when I brought information like this to the table. It was always, can we afford it or can we not? At that point, it's really not. It's not an operational decision. The operational decision has been made. So, what does good look like? Good is defensible. And if we go back to that slide right there, that is defendable data. Why am I changing my capital plan? Because that data, it is defensible. It's, you know, it's rooted in actual costs that have been associated with that equipment item over time. So, really quick here, how can FMX help out? That's where I know when I purchased FMX about 6 years ago, uh, one of the reasons that I leaned into that was because I wanted that data to be in my fingertips. I didn't need to create, a pivot table for 4 hours to have a 1 hour conversation with someone. I needed the data to be at my fingertips. And so stuff like the work summary dashboard, how can we pull information out and say, what's that trend of work orders versus completed work orders incoming versus work orders going out. I showed you that chart earlier, put it overlaying those two things on top of each other. What if we dig into one specific technician, see how they're performing as far as their work orders they're completing? Let's look at our response rates. How many tickets are going into an overdue state? Let's look specifically at maintenance requests. Overdue. This is the way I used to use these dashboards was I may click on a specific department. I would look at overdue tickets. I would look at who they're assigned to, try to figure out if there's an assignment issue, if there's a routing issue, how can we improve our programs? That's what I was always looking for. Another one is like the team performance dashboard. So here you're able to drill to a specific technician, maybe see how many tickets have they resolved each week over the past 12 weeks. That's valid data when we start backing up to that very first chart that I showed you, where it's, hey, here's my overall performance of my team, but what about let's look at the individual? Let's look at the department specifically. How many labor hours are they tracking week over week? And yeah, this is a demo environment I'm showing you here, and that's not very good performance on their hourlies, on the number of hours they're tracking per week, but just showing you how easy this should be able to pull that data out. I like to pull this information out when we're talking about evaluation time. This can be positive and negative both, right? We can look to improve, or we can encourage that, hey, you're doing a fantastic job. You're closing out a ton of tickets every week. Print this off, stick it in the evaluation folder. Nobody likes doing evaluations, but now we have a data-driven evaluation for someone to look at. So data doesn't have to always be used to justify getting something new and shiny. It can be used to work with our employees, work with our current processes, show them the good work they're doing, justify what they're doing. And then as we start talking about capital planning a little bit, how are we identifying with data right here to say, hey, my assets that are in fair condition, for example, if I scroll down now, look, I see maintenance cost right there at the top. There's 4 items that are accumulating some maintenance cost. Maybe I want to move those forward a little bit, but then the rest of the items on this page, hey, they're performing great, haven't had any maintenance costs associated with them. Maybe we'll shift those back because we see that big spike right there on the right on 2030, that $7 million right there at that one middle school. We may never get $7 million in 1 year. So what are we going to do? We're going to start shifting things forward and back. Well, what happens when that particular school is one where we're getting pressures from the board or something to do a lot of work in? Well, now we can show the data. The reason we're not replacing the air handlers at that building is they're performing fantastic. But we're going to go ahead and replace the chiller because the chiller's got some issues, but we're going to defer those air handlers a few more years. We have data to back that up. What's our maintenance cost over time? If we're not tying our maintenance costs to our assets, we're missing a huge value add to having a CMMS system in place, just so that we can justify those decisions as we move forward. So my advice here is there's a couple ways we can approach this. If we don't have a CMMS system at all, how do we start? Well, we start by some of the simple things that I talked about. How many work orders are we receiving? How many are we completing every month? Track it in a spreadsheet. How many PMs am I doing each month? Maybe we expand a little further and say, how many labor hours does each employee have each week? We can start with some really small things that we can track. And what we're going to be able to do with that is justify getting an appropriate system in place because we're going to be able to start showing the data. And in 2026, if we're not approaching a conversation with data, we're not going to get what we're asking for. It's just the simple fact of it. 2019, 2020, that really started shifting. That narrative had to shift. And if it wasn't shifting, we were falling behind. If you already have a system in place, can it give you the data that you need to be able to see? Can you see things like work order volume, asset age and condition, labor hours? How many parts are we using? Various things like that. If you have a system in place, let's start pulling that information and tracking that. Write it down once a month. Hey, what does this look like? What does this look like? And then we can start. If we go all the way back to where I began the conversation at with work orders in, work orders out, in your current program, it should tell you some kind of story. When it tells you that story, go with that story, go where it leads you. Does it lead you down a path of capital issues? Does it lead you down a path of efficiency or effectiveness issues within your own internal labor force? Where does it push you? In my story, it led me toward addressing, the operational efficiency within the maintenance division. That's where it led me. But then from there, it can branch again and it can go all kinds of different ways. But then when we start pulling that information out, we can use that to justify our needs going forward. Do we need more employees? Do we need, or we need to replace that chiller that's 10 years before its estimated replacement cycle? We can replace it early because we're going to defer this other one because it's not costing us anything. That's how data can work for us. But then thirdly, if you do have a very effective CMMS program, maybe you're using FMX. I know several of you on the call are. Do you know how to grab that data out of the system? If you don't, that's what we're here for, to help you out with that, to try to show you how to more effectively use the dashboards, build specific dashboards that will help you grab the data at your fingertips, but then start using that during regular updates. I love to have this stuff like on the forefront. When we start talking to our boards, do regular updates. Hey, here, if we think about some of the basic things on this page, let's do twice a year. Let's update the board and say, this is the number of work orders we received. This is the number we completed per month over a 1 year period of time. This is the number of labor hours that we accrued. Something basic. Start putting it in front of them routinely, because then when you bring the ask, the other data is already sitting in the back of their mind. So let's start telling that story so they're not making that story up for you. That's, to me, that's how you get things done. So I want to wrap this back around to the exact same conversation or the opening comment that I have. You're doing more than people realize. Make sure they can see it. If we can take the data, put it at the forefront instead of just working in the mechanical room, we can put that out front so that when something does go wrong, you're already seen for all the good things you're doing too. And it's not just negative moments that happen. Make sure they can see the good stuff too. Let's not overlook it. Let's get things done. That's the goal of using data. Happy to entertain questions. I know we wrapped up a little bit earlier than planned, but happy to entertain any questions. You can pop those in the webinar chat if you'd like, and we'll go from there. I'll do my best to answer what I can, and happy to connect afterwards as well. Welcome to reach out to me directly. We also have some other industry experts that are working with our team. For example, Darren Porter, I actually report to him. He was a K-12 industry leader as well up in Ohio. Matt Pace out in Arizona, worked in K-12 operations for some time. And then, Brandy's with our customer support team and has implemented tons of people, worked with tons of districts across the nation. Brian, stamped engineer, the founder of our company, has worked with tons of districts as well. Again, happy to entertain any questions.